There's a moment in every family story where everything changes forever. Not a gradual shift, not a slow unraveling. A single moment, a single decision, a single sound, and then silence. For Shane Moore, that moment came on a warm July morning on a quiet ranch in Southern Oregon. He had spent years pouring his life into that land. Years of sacrifice, years of loyalty, years of showing up for people who, in the end, would not show up for him. He walked toward a door that morning, not knowing it would be the last door he ever approached. Not knowing that behind it, someone who shared his blood had already made a decision. Not knowing that a gun had been sitting under a towel on the kitchen table. Waiting. One shot. That was all it took. And as Shane Moore lay, bleeding on the porch of his family's ranch, the family home he had given up everything to maintain, his own sister stood over him. Not calling for help. Not reaching for him. Not weeping. Screaming. D. 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 Those words. From his own family. Those were some of the last things Shane Moore ever heard. Welcome to Unthinkable Cases. I want you to take a breath before we go any further, because what you are about to hear is not a screenplay. It is not a dramatization. Every single detail of this story is real. Every date, every name, every horrifying moment is documented in court records, police reports, and public testimony. And the most unthinkable part of all of this? The person who pulled that trigger didn't go into hiding afterward. Didn't fall apart. Didn't disappear. She went to audition for a horror movie while awaiting trial for murder. This is the channel dedicated to telling the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss a case. And if you have been here before, thank you, genuinely, for coming back. Today, we are telling the story of Shane Moore. Not the story of his killer. Not the story of the audition or the courtroom or the headlines. Shane's story. Because he was a real person. A son, a brother, a caretaker, a man who gave up everything for the people he loved. And he deserves to be remembered. So let's go back to the beginning. Shane Moore came into this world in 1953 in the state of New Jersey, the middle child in a family of 5 children. 5 kids is a full house by any standard, and Shane grew up right in the center of it all. Not the eldest, not the youngest, just the steady middle ground. And in many ways, that is exactly the role he would play for the rest of his life. His father was an admiral in the United States Navy. And if you know anything about military families, you already know what that meant for Shane's childhood. Constant movement. New schools, new towns, new faces every few years. The kind of upbringing that either breaks a person or builds in them an incredible sense of adaptability. For Shane, it seemed to do the latter. After graduating from high school, Shane set his sights west. He packed up and moved to California, specifically to San Francisco, where he enrolled in law school at UC Hastings, one of the most respected law programs in the state of California. He worked hard, he stayed focused, and he passed the bar exam. And then he did something that, honestly, I find completely remarkable. He never practiced law, not once, not a single day. Instead, Shane Moore looked at everything he had built toward, the degree, the credential, the prestige, and he said, "This is not who I am." And he opened an antique bookstore. Now I want you to sit with that for just a moment. Because in a world where so many people spend their lives chasing titles and salaries and the approval of other people, Shane simply chose joy. He chose meaning. He chose to wake up every morning and do something that genuinely made him happy. And if that doesn't tell you something profound about the kind of man he was, then I don't know what will. He built a quiet, fulfilling life in Northern California. And for many years, that was enough. But in the year 2000, everything shifted. Shane's father, the Navy admiral who had shaped so much of his early life, was diagnosed with ALS, a progressive, degenerative neurological disease with no cure. A disease that slowly robs a person of their ability to move, to speak, to breathe. It is one of the most difficult diagnoses a family can receive, and a Moore family received it together. Shane didn't hesitate. He didn't deliberate. He didn't weigh the pros and cons of uprooting his life. He simply decided, and he moved. He packed up everything he had built in Northern California and relocated to his parents' ranch in Southern Oregon. Not for a weekend, not for a few weeks, permanently. He moved in as his father's full-time live-in caretaker, and he took that responsibility with everything he had. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Shane maintained the property. He handled the grocery shopping. He managed the day-to-day logistics of running a household for aging parents. And when his father's condition progressed, when the ALS had taken enough of his body that he could no longer move himself, Shane was there, lifting him, carrying him from his wheelchair to his bed, from his bed to the shower. Every single day, without complaint, without recognition, without any expectation of reward. His brother later reflected on how much Shane had given during those years. How present he was. How tireless. How genuinely devoted to his parents he had been. Shane Moore was a good man. That is simply the truth of it. In that same year, the year 2000, Shane's younger sister Kelly and her children also moved onto the ranch. And this is where the story begins to change. To understand what happened to Shane Moore, you have to understand Kelly fully, because Kelly is not a simple person. She is not someone who can be summed up in a sentence or two. She is layered, complicated, and in many ways, deeply contradictory. And everything that unfolded on that ranch in Southern Oregon flows directly from who she was and the choices she made. Kelly was Shane's younger sister by approximately 4 years. Like her brother, she had pursued law, graduating from UC Berkeley School of Law, which is not a small achievement. From Berkeley, she moved to Los Angeles and joined a prestigious law firm, where her career was off to a genuinely impressive start. She even represented Anna Nicole Smith at one point, a name that anyone familiar with high-profile celebrity cases will immediately recognize. By any external measure, Kelly was thriving, and then she met Daniel Reed. Daniel was an actor, charming, creative, ambitious in that particular Hollywood way. The two of them fell into each other's orbit and eventually married. And together, they did something that seemed to crystallize everything they both wanted. They co-wrote a book called Deadly Medicine. The book performed well. Impressively well, actually. It was successful enough to be adapted into a television movie, which was a significant achievement for a first major project. And the two of them rode that wave with everything they had. They were building something, a career in entertainment, a life in Los Angeles, a future that felt full of possibility. 1 month after the book was published, in 1989, Kelly gave birth to their first child, a daughter, named Aline Tucker Moore Reed, but everyone called her Tucker. They would go on to have 2 more children after Tucker. But even as their family grew, their professional momentum began to stall. The entertainment industry is notoriously unforgiving. You are only as relevant as your last success. And after Deadly Medicine, the work simply dried up. No new projects, no new deals, no next chapter. The one-hit wonder trap had closed around them. And when the money gets tight and the career stalls and the future that felt so bright starts to dim, people change. Relationships fracture. And the home that Daniel Reed later described as a war zone was exactly that. Constant fighting, persistent tension, an environment that no child should have to grow up inside. The marriage eventually collapsed entirely. When Kelly and Daniel divorced, the battle over their children became its own war. Kelly wanted full custody. Daniel tried to prevent it. He stood in family court and said, plainly, directly, on the record, that he believed something terrible would happen to those children if Kelly was given sole custody. The court did not listen. Kelly was granted full custody, and she took Tucker and the other children straight to the ranch in Southern Oregon. Her parents, recognizing that the main ranch house wasn't large enough for everyone, purchased a separate home on the property for Kelly and the kids to live in. They also provided her with a monthly allowance. Kelly did not need to work. She did not need to worry about income. She had a roof over her head, money coming in, and all the time in the world to focus on her children. And focus she did, particularly on Tucker. Tucker Reed was, from the very beginning, a performer. From the time she was small, she gravitated toward the spotlight. Local theater productions, school performances, anything that put her on a stage in front of an audience. She had the kind of presence that demands attention, and she knew it. And Kelly fed that energy with everything she had. Kelly was the quintessential theater mother. She attended every single performance. She did Tucker's hair. She applied Tucker's makeup. She sewed Tucker's costumes with her own hands. Some of Tucker's classmates reportedly found it excessive, even embarrassing. But Tucker never seemed to mind. If anything, it brought the two of them closer together. Mother and daughter, completely aligned, completely committed to a shared dream. Tucker attended Ashland High School, which carried a strong reputation for its theater program. And by the time she was preparing to graduate, her ambitions were entirely clear. Her yearbook quote, listed under future plans, read as follows. If all else fails, marry a well-heeled, well-connected, blockbuster movie-making Hollywood producer, preferably with a summer home on the Cape. Now, that is a statement. Whether she meant it entirely seriously or whether there was some self-aware humor buried in there. Honestly, knowing what we know about Tucker, it is genuinely hard to say. But it captures something essential about who she was. Ambitious, theatrical, completely unafraid to be audacious. Kelly talked openly about Tucker's future in ways that revealed just how deeply her own hopes and dreams were tangled up in her daughter's potential. A friend of Kelly's later recalled her saying that she would be set for life once Tucker became a famous actress. Not that Tucker would be successful. That Kelly would be set for life. That distinction matters. The two of them were so committed to building Tucker's career that they co-wrote a young adult book series together called Amber House. Tucker even narrated the audiobook version herself. But Tucker's time at USC became complicated in ways that would follow her far beyond the campus. Several years into her enrollment, Tucker filed a civil complaint and formal report against a former boyfriend, alleging sexual assault. The Student Judicial Affairs Committee launched an investigation. After reviewing the evidence, the committee concluded that there was insufficient proof to support the claim. Now, and I want to be careful here because this matters, sexual assault allegations on college campuses are frequently mishandled. Victims are disbelieved. Evidence is dismissed. Survivors are failed by institutions that prioritize reputation over justice. That is a documented reality. And I am not in a position to tell you definitively what happened between Tucker and her former boyfriend. What I can tell you is what happened next. Tucker responded to the committee's finding by escalating publicly. She held a press conference on the USC campus. She gave interviews to major national outlets, including CNN. She wrote opinion pieces about her experience for various publications. She was determined to make herself heard. Her ex-boyfriend denied every allegation entirely and filed a defamation lawsuit against her in response. The precise legal outcome remains somewhat unclear. Different reports indicate different results. Some say both lawsuits were ultimately dismissed. Others report that Tucker reached a financial settlement and was legally prohibited from ever speaking about him publicly again. What is clear is that Tucker eventually withdrew from USC entirely. In around 2013, she moved back to Oregon, back to the ranch, back to Kelly. And whatever complications had followed her from Los Angeles, they were nothing compared to what was waiting for her at home. Money has a way of doing something to families that nothing else can quite replicate. It doesn't just create conflict. It reveals conflict that was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to come fully into the light. In the Moore family, those conditions have been building for years. And by the time Tucker returned to Oregon in 2013, the situation had reached a level of toxicity that was genuinely dangerous. Here is what you need to understand about the inheritance arrangement. Shane and Kelly's parents had made a deliberate decision. Of their 5 children, only 2 would inherit the family property, Shane and Kelly. The logic, presumably, was tied to their proximity and involvement. Kelly would receive the home she was already living in. Shane and Kelly would divide the ranch itself equally, a straight 50-50 split. On the surface, it seemed straightforward enough. But then their father died, and without him there to provide any kind of steadying presence, Kelly's financial behavior escalated dramatically. She hadn't worked in years. Her only income was whatever her mother Laura chose to give her. And after their father passed, those amounts grew increasingly unchecked. Kelly's financial demands became so excessive, so relentless, that Laura eventually remortgaged the ranch property. The figure attached to that remortgage was approximately $900,000, and the majority of that money flowed in one direction, toward Kelly. $900,000, drawn from a property that Shane had given years of his life to maintain. A property he was legally entitled to inherit half of. A property that was being quietly hollowed out from underneath him. And Shane knew it. He watched his mother being financially drained. He watched the value of his own future inheritance being systematically diminished. He watched and he seethed. Because what do you do when the person taking advantage of your elderly mother is your own sister? What recourse do you reach for when the damage is happening inside your own family? The tension between Shane and Kelly became a constant current running through life on that ranch. And then one of Kelly's other brothers, fed up with what he was watching, tried to confront her directly about the money, to put some kind of limit on what was happening. Kelly's response was to come after him with a fireplace poker. That is the kind of person we're dealing with. And still the financial pressure continued to mount. At one point, Kelly decided she wanted to harvest every single tree on the ranch property and sell the timber to a lumber yard. An impulsive, destructive plan to generate quick cash from land that was not entirely hers to exploit. When the lumber workers arrived to begin the harvest, Shane stopped them. He explained, calmly, legally, that because the property had been remortgaged, cutting down those trees without the bank's knowledge and consent was illegal. The workers understood immediately and left the property without cutting a single tree. When Kelly found out, She was absolutely furious. The arguments between Shane and Kelly that had been simmering for years began to boil over with increasing frequency and intensity. Their fights became loud, vicious, and completely unrestrained. And then, in 2016, something happened that changed the legal landscape of their conflict entirely. During one particularly explosive argument about money, as always, Shane threw a gas canister. It struck Tucker in the face. Shane maintained immediately and consistently that it was an accident, that he had not intended to hit anyone. Tucker and Kelly told police it was an intentional act of violence. They pressed charges. They applied for and received an order of protection against Shane, and Shane was arrested for fourth-degree assault. That order of protection was significant, because it meant Shane was now legally prohibited from entering the family home. He could be on the property, it was his inheritance too, but he could not cross the threshold of that front door. Kelly moved quickly. With Shane now legally compromised in her eyes, she saw an opportunity. She began drafting a new will for their mother, a document that stated explicitly that if anything happened to any of them, or to the property, Shane would be completely cut out, disinherited, written out of everything he had sacrificed years of his life for. Shane found out about the will, and he moved faster. He approached his mother Laura with a proposal, a grant deed, a legal document that would immediately and formally divide the ranch property, separating his half from Kelly's half and shielding his inheritance from Kelly's debts. It was a clean, legal solution. It would protect what was rightfully his without requiring Kelly's cooperation or approval. Laura agreed to sign it. Shane arranged for a notary to come to the ranch on July 26, 2016, to make the document official. Her name was Carla, and she had absolutely no idea what she was driving into that morning. Carla had communicated with Shane only through text messages. She had never spoken to him by phone. She had never met anyone in the Moore family before that morning. As far as she knew, she was going to a quiet rural property to notarize a standard legal document. Routine work. In and out. What she walked into was anything but routine. When she arrived at the ranch, Shane's friend Carlton was waiting for her at the gate. He greeted her and directed her to drive up toward the main house. As she pulled up and stepped out of her vehicle, she immediately noticed something that made her uneasy. She couldn't quite name it at first, just a feeling. Something in the air of that place that felt wrong. She walked inside. Kelly and Laura were seated at the kitchen table. Tucker was standing in the corner, silent, still, watching. Kelly was already yelling before Carla could fully process the scene. She was demanding to see the document, demanding to know what was in it. Her voice was raised and her posture was aggressive, and Carla, who had come here simply to do her job, found herself standing in the middle of something she had no context for and no way to navigate. A few minutes passed, and then Shane appeared on the porch. What Carla did not yet know, what no one had told her, was that Shane was not legally permitted to come through the front door. The order of protection Tucker had obtained meant he had to stay outside. He was standing on the porch of his own family's ranch, locked out by a court order, watching through the window as the legal future of his inheritance played out inside. Kelly looked at the document, and then she grabbed it, and she tore it apart. Shane watched it happen from outside. He saw the deed, the document his mother had agreed to sign, the legal protection he had carefully arranged, reduced to pieces by his sister's hands. And he began walking toward the front door. Kelly moved to block him. She ran to the door first. And in that same moment, that same fraction of a second, Tucker reached under a towel that had been sitting on the kitchen table since before Carla arrived. A towel that had been there the entire time. Beneath it was a gun. Tucker took the gun, and she followed her mother to the door. A single gunshot rang out. Carla's mind snapped into emergency mode. She moved immediately toward the nearest phone, a landline mounted somewhere in the house. She tried to dial 911. The call would not connect. She tried again. Nothing. Seconds passed. And then Kelly walked back into the kitchen. She was holding the gun at her side. Carla looked at it. She looked at Kelly, and she asked, as steadily as she could, for Kelly to hand the weapon over. Kelly looked back at her and said no. Then the phone rang. Dispatch was calling back on a landline. Carla grabbed it. Yes, I need somebody out here right away. I need an ambulance. Tell me what the emergency is. I didn't see anything. All I can tell you is a gun went off. Are you in danger? Yes. Dispatch instructed Carla to pass the phone to someone near the victim. She handed it to Laura, and the moment she did, Carla used that window to get out. She moved toward the door, toward the porch, toward the outside air and the open space and whatever was waiting beyond the walls of that house. And she found Shane. He was lying on the front porch, bleeding, and something struck her immediately, something she would later describe in detail to investigators. He was much further from the front door than should have been possible. The distance between where he lay and the threshold of that door didn't make sense to her. It was wrong in a way she couldn't fully articulate in that moment, but couldn't stop thinking about afterward. Shane Moore was dying on the porch of his family's ranch. And inside that house, on that 911 call, the call that was still active, the call that connected this dying man to the outside world, something was happening that defies description. Dispatch had Kelly on the line. They were attempting to walk her through CPR, talking her through the steps, trying to save her brother's life. Kelly refused. She told the dispatcher that she wanted Shane to die. And in the background of that recording, audible, documented, preserved, you can hear her voice. D. Her brother was bleeding out on the porch. His friend Carlton had arrived and was doing everything he could, desperately, helplessly, to keep Shane alive with his own hands. And Kelly was screaming for him to go. Shane Moore died before the first responders arrived. A single gunshot wound to the chest. He was 62 years old. When law enforcement arrived at the ranch on the afternoon of July 26, 2016, they were walking into a scene that raised immediate and serious questions. A man was dead. A gun had been fired. Multiple people had been present, and the stories were already beginning to take shape. Tucker and Kelly were brought into the police station for questioning separately, and what investigators observed during those interviews would stay with them. Tucker came in quiet, subdued, presenting herself as small and fragile and frightened. She told police that Shane had been a violent man, unstable, dangerous. She said she had been genuinely afraid of him. She was working hard to frame the shooting and everything that led to it as an act rooted in fear and self-preservation. And then she stopped talking. She informed investigators that she would not say another word until she had legal representation present, which is, without question, her constitutional right. The interview paused. Investigators stepped out, and a few minutes later, one of them glanced at the monitor connected to the interrogation room camera. Tucker was alone in the room. She thought no one was watching. She was waving at the camera, not nervously, not anxiously, waving, like a performer acknowledging an audience, like someone who knew she was being watched and decided to play to it. That single moment, that wave, told investigators something important about the woman they were dealing with, about the gap between the performance she was putting on and whatever was actually happening underneath it. Kelly's interview was its own category of disturbing. She didn't perform vulnerability the way Tucker had. She was combative, defensive, and the things she said, the way she spoke about her brother, even in a police interview, were chilling. Both women lawyered up. The formal questioning ended, but the investigation was just beginning. As investigators worked to piece together the events of July 26th, the picture that emerged was deeply troubling, and it pointed in a clear and unavoidable direction. The gun had been under the towel on that kitchen table before Carla ever arrived. That detail alone was significant. This was not a spontaneous act. The weapon had been there, ready, waiting. The question of who placed it there, and when, and why, became central to understanding what had actually happened that morning. Carla's testimony was invaluable. She had been a neutral party, no stake in the family conflict, no history with any of the people involved. She had walked in cold, observed what she observed, and was now telling investigators exactly what she had seen and heard. Her account was consistent, credible, and deeply damning. Carlton's account of arriving at the scene and finding Shane on the porch, of doing everything in his power to save his friend's life while chaos unfolded around him, painted a picture of the final moments that was heartbreaking and enraging in equal measure. The 911 recording was evidence of a different kind. Audio does not lie. Audio does not perform or strategize or lawyer up. The voice on that recording, screaming die while her brother bled out, was Kelly's. Undeniable. Documented. Preserved forever. Forensic analysis of the gunshot wound and the physical evidence at the scene helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. The trajectory, the distance, the positioning, all of it began to cohere into a narrative that directly contradicted the story Tucker and Kelly were attempting to tell. This had not been a panicked reaction to an immediate threat. The gun had been placed on that table in advance. Shane had been on the other side of the front door, outside, legally prohibited from entering when a shot was fired. The physical evidence of where his body was found was inconsistent with the defensive shooting scenario the women were trying to construct. The district attorney's office reviewed everything, and charges were filed. Tucker Reed was charged with murder in the second degree. Kelly was charged as well, as a party to the crime, for her role in what prosecutors would argue was a coordinated act, not an isolated moment of panic. The legal machinery was now in motion, and the community of Southern Oregon, which had watched this family's dysfunction play out over years, was paying close attention. And this is the part of the story that made national headlines. The part that caused people who had never heard of Shane Moore or Kelly Reed or Tucker Reed to suddenly know their names. While Tucker was awaiting trial for the murder of her uncle, while she was out on bail, while the legal process was grinding forward, while Shane Moore's family was navigating grief and trauma and the impossible weight of what had happened, Tucker went to an audition for a horror movie, a low-budget independent horror film, the kind that gets made on shoestring productions with small crews and even smaller distribution. Tucker sought out the role. She pursued it. She showed up and she performed for the camera and she got the part. The film was called, and this detail is almost too on the nose to believe, a title that positioned her as exactly the kind of dark, dramatic figure she seemed to want to project. She had always wanted to be an actress. Kelly had always believed she would become one. And here, in the most disturbing, tone-deaf, staggering display of self-absorption imaginable, Tucker was making that dream come true, while her uncle lay in a grave, while a trial date was being set, while Carla and Carlton and Laura and Shane's other brothers were living with the aftermath of what had happened on that porch. Tucker was auditioning for a horror movie. I have covered a significant number of criminal cases in my time on this channel. I have told you about people who have done shocking, incomprehensible, deeply disturbing things. But I genuinely struggle to recall another case where someone charged with killing a family member responded by attempting to launch an acting career. The audacity of it. The sheer, staggering audacity. It said everything about Tucker Reed that her lawyers probably wished it hadn't. The courtroom proceedings in the case of Shane Moore's murder were, predictably, intense. Tucker and Kelly both maintained that the shooting had been an act of self-defense, that Shane had been the aggressor, that they had been afraid, that the gun under the towel, on the kitchen table, in a house Shane was legally prohibited from entering, had been there for protection, that everything that happened on July 26, 2016 had been a terrified response to a dangerous, volatile man. The prosecution methodically dismantled that narrative. They put Carla on the stand. She described arriving at the ranch with no knowledge of the family's history, no stake in the outcome, nothing to gain from telling anything other than exactly what she had witnessed. And what she had witnessed, Kelly's aggression, Tucker reaching under that towel, the sequence of events that led to the gunshot, directly contradicted the defense's account. They introduced the 911 recording, played it for the jury. Let them hear Kelly's voice. Let them hear the screaming. Let them hear die, die, die. In real time, preserved audio coming from the woman sitting in that courtroom claiming she had acted out of fear for her life. They presented the forensic evidence, the trajectory of the bullet, the location of Shane's body relative to the front door. The physical impossibility of the scenario the defense was asking the jury to accept. They walked the jury through the financial history, the remortgage, the $900,000, the lumber operation that Shane had shut down, the torn grant deed, the years of escalating conflict that had built to this moment. They showed the jury that this was not a spontaneous act of panic. It was the culmination of a years-long battle over inheritance and money and control that ended with a gun that had been placed on a table before the notary ever arrived. The defense argued. They pushed back on the financial narrative. They emphasized the gas canister incident from earlier in 2016, the order of protection, the assault charge, the documented history of volatility between Shane and the family. They tried to paint Shane as a man who had made his own loved ones genuinely afraid. But the jury had heard the recording. They had heard die, D. Tucker Reed was convicted of murder in the second degree. Kelly Reed was convicted as well, found guilty for her role in her brother's death. Sentencing followed conviction. And the women who had stood over Shane Moore while he bled, who had refused to perform CPR, who had screamed for him to die, who had then tried to build separate legal strategies to walk away from what they had done, were going to prison. Shane Moore was 62 years old when he died on the porch of a ranch he had devoted years of his life to maintaining. He had been born in New Jersey, raised by a Navy admiral, educated in California, and drawn to Oregon by love for his family and loyalty to his father in his final years. He gave up his antique bookstore. He gave up his independence. He gave up the quiet, joyful, self-directed life he had built in Northern California, a life built on his own terms, doing something he loved, answering to no one. He gave all of that up to carry his father from a wheelchair to a shower, to run the groceries, to maintain the property, to show up day after day for people who shared his blood. And in the end, the people who shared his blood were the ones who took everything from him. His mother, Laura, had watched it all. had agreed to sign the grant deed that she hoped would protect her son's future, had been on the phone with dispatch while her daughter screamed and her son died. What she carried with her after that morning, what she lived with for however long remained to her, is something I cannot fully imagine. Carlton, the friend who met Carla at the gate and then ran to Shane's side and tried desperately to save him with his own hands. He carried that afternoon with him too. The helplessness of it, the horror of it, and Carla, the notary who had simply shown up to do her job, who had walked into a family's war zone with no warning and no protection, and who had found Shane bleeding on the porch when she tried to leave. She gave testimony that helped put his killers in prison. And that matters. That is something real and significant in an otherwise almost unbearably dark story. Shane Moore deserved better than what his family gave him. He deserved to inherit the land he had worked. He deserved to see the legal protection he had arranged for himself actually take effect. He deserved to grow old on that Oregon ranch and maybe open another bookstore somewhere and live out his days on his own terms, the way he always had. He deserved a sister who would have performed CPR instead of screaming for him to die. He didn't get any of that. But he gets this. His name, spoken clearly, his story told fully, his life acknowledged for everything it was before that July morning took it. Shane Moore, born in 1953, died on July 26, 2016. A son, a brother, a caretaker, a man who loved antique books and followed his joy and gave his best years to the people he loved. Remember him. This case shook me. And I hope it has moved you in some way too, because these are the stories that remind us why this work matters. Why it is important to say the names of victims clearly and loudly, and without letting their killers overshadow them. Shane Moore was real. His life was real. His sacrifice was real. And his death, the way it happened, the sounds that surrounded his final moments, that is something that should never be forgotten. If this story affected you, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you were thinking. Tell me what part of this case stopped you cold. This community exists because of conversations like that, and I read every single one of them. And if you're not yet part of this community, if you found this video through a search or a recommendation and this is your first time here, then please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Every case we cover on this channel is real. Every victim deserves to be remembered. And there are so many more stories still to tell. Like this video if it moved you. Share it if you think someone else needs to hear Shane's story. And leave a comment, even just his name, even just Shane Moore, because saying it matters. Remembering it matters. I will see you on the next case.